We are now moving into one of the key highlights of the day, the plenary lecture on building a climate resilient and regenerative economy, strategies for sustainable growth. As we continue our discussion on global economic and environmental challenges, we are fortunate to have two eminent experts who bring exceptional insights to today's session. First, allow me to introduce our moderator, Dr. Resham Thapa. Dr. Thapa holds a PhD in economics from the University of Hull in the UK and brings over 15 years of distinguished experience in academia and policy. He has served as the member secretary to the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in Nepal, with research spanning environmental economics, climate change, and international trade. Dr. Thapa's expertise, particularly in CGE modeling and navigating the trade-offs of green growth, makes him a highly regarded authority in these fields. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Resham Thapa as he leads us through today's important session. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Abrar Chaudhary from Said Business School, University of Oxford. Dr. Chaudhary is a globally recognized scholar specializing in environmental change, climate finance, and corporate purpose. His research, including important work on climate change adaptation in Nepal, provides valuable insights into the power dynamics influencing adaptation policies in the agricultural sector. Currently affiliated with Oxford's Environmental Change Institute and a British Academy Fellow, Dr. Chaudhary's work critically examines the role of climate finance mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund, and the impact of emerging technologies in shaping climate action across developing regions. Today, Dr. Chaudhary will be presenting his lecture on building a climate resilient and regenerative economy, strategies for sustainable growth. His presentation will offer innovative strategies to address environmental crisis while promoting sustainable economic growth. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Abrar Chaudhary. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are almost there. My role is just introducing Abrar, and if a couple of queries and questions at last, and then picking it and just facilitating to reach Abrar's reach only. In that sense, I'll be consuming less minutes, as less as possible, and try to allocate more time for our invited keynote speaker, Dr. Abrar Chaudhary. Before starting his formal write-up here, some few informal lines I do have how we approached Abrar. Long back, must be 2010 to 12, we worked in South Asian climate scenarios because we talked already, right? This global IPCC report never recognized South Asia separately. That was the selling point from a team of researchers from Oxford, including Abrar and Ariala. We should not forget another name, Ariala, professor there, and one of the supervisors of Abrar. And we worked together across South Asia regarding this South Asian climate scenarios. And right from that day, I was impressed the way these people were working, the way the semi-formally these people used to work, and the depth of the knowledge they used to delve into. And I was quite impressed, and later as I was pursuing my PhD in England, then we met again a couple of times in Oxford Scenarios program and conferences that these guys knows more than me about Nepal. And these guys knows a lot of climate change, climate financing, and policy issues than us regarding Nepal. And I was impressed right from that day, and as we decided the theme basically climate change and climate finance and climate scenarios and related development issues in Nepal. Then we decided this cohort, out of that cohort, Abrar could be one of the best match to our theme. That's how we approach him. And thank you, Abrar, for accepting our proposal, and all the way from England, Oxford, to here, coming and accepting our proposal and coming all the way. Then let me introduce him formally in his profile. I'm trying to be brief in 2 paragraphs only. Dr. Abrar Chaudhary is a senior academic at Said Business School, University of Oxford, and Grimtempton College. He previously held a prestigious multi-year British Academy Fellowship on climate finance. Abrar's research interests span challenges at the intersection of environmental management, climate change, sustainable development, climate finance, and corporate purpose. With over 25 years of global experience in technology, consulting, and research, Abrar has worked in governments, funders, private sector, and research institutes to translate evidences into action and addresses complex environmental challenges. Our previous chair of the session already spelled out about the methodology that a systemic approach, and this is where these guys and team of Abrar are the champion on this systemic approach. And then having said that, Abrar is currently investigating the interplay between dedicated climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund and emerging technologies, and how they influence the implementation and diffusion of climate action in emerging economies. I iterate again, emerging economies. Additionally, he is collaborating with UNDP to examine how different climate funding instruments builds resilience on the ground. His past projects include a collaboration with Oxford and EY Global to explore corporate purpose and sustainability at large global MNCs, multinational companies, in a volatile global economy. Abrar has contributed to numerous climate projects funded by prestigious organizations such as World Bank, UK Aid, US Aid, CCAFS, and spanning across more than 10 countries, of course, including Nepal. Abrar is an experienced teacher and program director of Oxford's Custom Education Portfolio, and contributing to the programs on MBA, EMBA, MSc, and executive education. He has published widely in leading academic journals and practices, presently at numerous international conferences. Abrar holds a PhD in environmental change management, awarded Best Dissertation Award at the Academy of Management, United States, and MBA as well as MSc in environmental management with distinction, all from the University of Oxford. And finally, he is a fellow chartered accountant. Prior to Oxford, Abrar was a partner in leading professional accounting service firms and working extensively in that area as well. Now, after this brief introduction of our invited guest, Abrar Chaudhary, and now I hand over the mic and podium to Abrar. And only the ground rules will try to be as possible as brief. And couple of questions only I will take and forward to Abrar. And let's make 40 minutes plus minus. I think we can enjoy 40 plus minus. Abrar, noted 42 plus minus minutes only. And podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you, Resham. Thank you, Naveen, and thank you to Tribune University for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be standing here, an opportunity to speak to all of you. These last 2 days have been fantastic for me as well. I've had the opportunity to listen to some fantastic speakers, some fantastic sessions, and what I'm hoping is that, through this lecture, I can build and bring many of these ideas together. So it was really good to see these sessions. But more importantly, sorry, I need the ticker. Yeah, more importantly, sorry, let me see if this works. Yeah, perfect. So more importantly, when Resham invited me to come to Nepal, I really actually jumped on this opportunity. And the reason was that my academic journey actually started from Nepal. My first research project in my PhD was in Nepal, and I was, as a not so young researcher, because I worked for many years before I went into academia. But I came to Nepal, and there was this big question I wanted to ask. Because whenever we talk about climate change, and to your point, now we call it climate emergency or a planetary crisis, coming from South Asia, what I saw was that we've been seeing impacts of climate change. We have monsoons every year. We have floods that come every year. But what I saw was a lack of inaction. That often we don't see a response. We're very good at a reactive response, but we're not very good at a proactive response. So I decided that the best way to learn is actually go on ground. And my supervisor was an anthropologist. So I went to him and I said, you know what, I really want to learn about climate change. How do I learn about climate change? And he said, Abrar, there's only one way to learn about climate change, is to actually go on ground where actually climate meets the people and planet. Because you have to observe it. We understand we need policy, we need planning, we need research, but we really have to go on ground. So I was fortunate. I spent many months in the Nepal's Tarai Plains. I worked with smallholder farmers. I tried to understand what they were doing. But one very interesting project before I get into this lecture, because I have this opportunity now to speak about Nepal, was even then we were thinking about, okay, how do we communicate about this phenomena of a climate that's changing? And of course, those are terminologies that are not really used by communities on ground. When we go to a small farmer, they will not say climate change, but they might say, oh, we're having a bit of variation in the rains, or we can see something's happening. There's a disease coming in that wasn't there before, or our planting season is changing. So for them, the way they operationalize climate change is on activities that they do. So it's very important to translate that. So at that point, we were like, okay, how do we show farmers that something is happening? Because it's also, imagine, as a researcher, as a policy maker, we have immense responsibility, because we are going on the ground, talking to communities, talking to farmers that are historically planting. They have a way, they're the experts, and someone else comes from outside and says, actually, I think you should change the way you're planting, or you should stop this, or you should plant something else. And what if we're wrong? What if the researcher is wrong? What if the policymaker is wrong? And that has happened many times, and that's why often with communities, with farmers, there is a very low level of trust. They don't trust external people, because often that support isn't there. So our project was very interesting. We, even then, this is, almost 13, 14 years ago, we used technology, and we said, if we use climate models, if we project climate change, they're already, if I look at Kathmandu, right, and I run a climate model, and it will say in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, the temperature in Kathmandu is going to be, 0.5 degree more, or there's going to be a variation of rain, or there might be a bit more drought. You can run models, and you can actually find locations right now which would have the same climatic environment that Kathmandu might have in 10 years' time. So we decided that the best way to do research is actually find those locations within Nepal, because Nepal is, as you know, is environmentally very diverse. From the Tarai Plains to the Everest, I think it's about 200 miles or 200 kilometers, you can see so many different ecosystems. So it was relatively simple to find locations. So we took all these farmers to these different locations and said, we're not showing you your future, but here is a plausible future. If you go to these locations, you can see how your village will be in 10 years' time. And if you talk to farmers that are already working there, are there strategies that you can adopt? And then we took them to multiple locations. So initially the farmers were very resistant. They were like, no, we don't believe in this, right? Or if we suggested them strategy that, why don't you share your materials or inputs? They were like, no, we don't want to share. But when they visited other communities, when they spoke to other farmers, they saw some different strategies. And when they came back, their mind was, I'm not saying it changed, but they were much more open. So for us, that lesson was that if we really want to talk about climate change, we have to be on the ground. We have to talk to the people. We have to talk to the communities. But we also have to build a lot of collaboration, a lot of dialogue. And when I look at this conference itself, I think this is a place we're having this collaboration. Many different minds and policymakers and government officials and researchers are speaking that allows us to think and broaden our perspective as well. So I wanted to start with Nepal, that my journey in Nepal, this was Farms of the Future, and we were trying to build this future to Oxford. So anything is possible. So I wanted to start with kind of framing what the objective of this session is, this plenary, right? And you've already heard many of those things. But I really want to communicate 3 things I hope that you take after this plenary. One element is that, I think it was an undertone in all the sessions that there is a tension between sustainability and growth. Like we want to grow, but it comes at some cost, or there are some challenges. It seems that the two are not compatible, and that's why we say sustainable growth. So I want to talk a little bit on the tension of sustainable growth. The second element I want to talk about is just going a little bit forward and saying, okay, what are the approaches to build sustainable development? How do we go from a linear economy to a regenerative economy? What would that look like? And then finally, I want to offer some examples and a way forward. Like, how can we approach that? And I'll bring examples from Nepal, but I do want, at this stage, you've heard a lot about Nepal, right? And a lot from experts that are much more capable, who have much more knowledge than I have about Nepal. So I don't want to spend too much time just talking about Nepal. I want you to step out and look at slightly the bigger picture that I can offer. So I use this image because, Nepal is a mountaineering place, right? We're surrounded by mountains. And here, you can see that, for anyone who does rock climbing, this is a piton. You use a piton. And this is an old picture, but for people who rock climb, for them, mountains are the most precious asset that they want to preserve. But if you keep climbing, this is for your safety, you have to hammer this in. And lots of these mountaineers started to see that actually their safety, their love, what they wanted to do, was destroying the very mountain they wanted to climb. So every time you made a hole in this. And this really, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call this dilemma, right? That at one point, we want sustainability. We want a sustainable planet. We don't want to harm the mountain. But on the other side, we want to keep climbing. We want to keep growing. We want more mountaineers to come in. We generate income. So how do you balance this dilemma? So we are, this is an economics conference, and I'm not an economist, but I did want to use, Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And when this question was posed to him, like, how do we balance these two? He came back with this very clear answer. He said, you know what? There is one and only one social purpose of a business, and we might take it to a country, is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. That we should focus because this is what an organization is set up to do. So focus on growing, and of course, don't cheat. Make sure there's social welfare. Make sure you're paying your taxes. Don't do anything illegal, but you should focus on what you're good at. That's what economics also tells us, focus on your competitive advantage. And so what has happened based on this phenomena? This is a long-term graph of GDP, and you can start to see that when the Industrial Revolution started to come in, our GDP started to grow. When we started to understand the concept of business and how businesses can actually generate money, we've done actually very, very well. We've taken Milton Friedman's lessons, and we've grown the global economy to 140 trillion dollars. So we've done a great job. But we're also seeing, when we see this growth, right, we can see that this growth is linear, right? And what it shows is that in another 10 years, 20 years, our economic system is built to just keep going up, right? Keep growing. We've successfully done it over the last 100 years, so what would stop us? But this growth has also offered us lots of advantages. Like this is a graph of poverty. And you can see South Asia as well, and you can see the world as well, that from 60% poverty rate, we've actually come down to 15. And that's a tremendous effort, a collective effort, to imagine the millions, actually billions of people that we've taken out from extreme poverty, who are doing well, who are middle class, who are sitting here. Our ancestors probably were not as wealthy. So poverty levels have come down, and I'm sure others can argue who were here, our health metrics have improved, our education metrics have improved, everything is on the rise. And that's at the back of that growth, because we are growing. Here's an example, because I look at big businesses as well. This is the latest valuation for Apple. And its latest valuation is $3.3 trillion. This is one business, because they've done really well in growing and using that philosophy. And actually, Apple is not alone. There are right now 6 companies that are worth over $1 trillion. So just to give you a perspective, Apple valuation is more than 195 countries in the world. Its valuation is close to, compared to GDP, close to the UK economy. So it would be like the 5th or the 6th largest country on its own. Here's GDP of Nepal, 44 billion. And we're a country, so its valuation is like 12% of just one corporation. Because that model was generated on growing. Like, as long as I don't know how many people use Apple, but I have a few products, and many have like 2, 3, 4 products. I sometimes ask people, I do this survey. And in the Western context, people will say, are we talking about me or are we talking about my family? Because if I add my family together, I probably have 10 Apple products. So they're solving a problem. These big corporations have understood how to make our lives easy. And so we're buying. But there's a very basic underlying assumption here in this growth model. And Schumacher was a wonderful economist back, I think, in the 60s or 70s, and he wrote this book called Small is Beautiful. And he said the underlying assumption in our growth model right now is that we have solved the challenge of production, that we can continue to produce. And we have those factories. You go to a factory in China that is Apple's factory, and you'll see a fantastic production line. But the challenge here is that, yes, financial capital may be unlimited because humans produce financial capital, right? You can go to a bank, you can start to print as much money as you want. So your financial capital can keep going. But what about natural capital? and I think some speakers in the last session started to talk about this, that there is a cap in the natural capital. So where is Apple's growth coming from? 60% of all battery products, cobalt, actually comes from Congo. And if you look at Congo, it's under conflict right now. There's war happening there. There's a lot of environmental degradation happening here. These are like the way cobalt is mined. So there's a lot of ethical and environmental challenges attached to that growth. This is the graph, and I think we saw the biodiversity, but if we again compare, this is like from the 1970, we can see our global GDP grow up. But what we're also seeing is that the raw material extraction is also going up. So all the growth that we're seeing coming from these global economies, from this growth, is backed by raw material extraction. We're consuming the natural capital. We're selling our natural capital, and so we're growing. Of course, our ecological footprint has gone up because we've consumed so much. Our forest covers have gone down. Our biodiversity has gone down by 70%. So all this growth is coming actually at a cost of biodiversity, ecological raw material, and this ecological footprint. Here are colleagues actually that have been working on these planetary boundaries. So Johann Rockström, he's based in Germany, and his colleagues actually have been tracking the world to see what's happening in this world. And they've created this planetary boundary concept. And what they're saying is that we as humans have already breached 5 of the critical boundaries out of the 9 boundaries that protect our environment, right? That protect this very, very sensitive planet. We've already breached the biosphere integrity. We've already breached our freshwater reserves. We've already have chemical flow. We're already like breaching the climate change element. So climate change is one element of the planetary boundary. The only thing actually we've done very well in is the ozone layer. We've actually to somehow close the ozone layer. So you'll start to see that the atmospheric ozone, or the stratospheric ozone layer has actually gone back. So what this shows us, this breach, that actually as society, as humans, if we put our minds together, we can solve this problem. It's not impossible. When ozone layer came together, we all came together and we found a way forward. So we are reaching, we've already actually not reaching these planetary boundaries, we've actually breached those planetary boundaries. And if you have time, you can actually look at Rockström's work. He does a lot of work on tipping points. And he said, all of this planet is actually connected. So when you breach one boundary, it has an impact on something else. So ice melt in the North Pole actually impacts the currents. And that actually changes the whole dynamic. So these are very, very critical elements. So what are we seeing? If, as economists, we're saying actually the time for linear growth is finished. It's coming to an end. And you will see a growth like this. This is time, and we're stabilizing. Or maybe now we'll start to go down because we will no longer have those resources. So it's a different model. This is what the economic model will look like. And this is what the realities we have to work in. But yet, our world is highly dependent on coal. Like despite all those challenges, despite the technologies there, the solar, hydro, and we heard a lot about Nepal's focus on hydro, but you'll still see that coal and gas dominate our energy systems. So it will take time to decouple, right? It's not easy to switch from this thing, even though we've known what's been happening. And that's why energy systems are key. They're the most emitting sector in the world. 2/3 or 3/4 of all emissions actually come from energy. And this is, we're talking about global energy. And I think what's also important is for Nepal to think, how are they moving forward in their energy system? And I did look at some of the facts for Nepal as well, because I wanted to see what's happening. And this is not electricity, this is energy use. And what we're seeing is, if you look at the mix here, I think it's not very clear, but 67% of the energy in Nepal is coming from biofuel and waste burning. That surprised me. But it was basically agriculture, waste burn, or timber, or wood, which means many people are disconnected in that energy system. Although Nepal has a very, very low emission, like it's 0.1% globally, but its rate of emission from 1990 to 2020 has doubled. So the question is, what will it look like in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? And I think that's important consideration to think about in terms of how Nepal is going to develop in its sustainable push. But at the same time, I think this is what the last session was, right? We heard about the impacts of climate change. We're already seeing those impacts, right? This is pollution from Kathmandu, and the last, from ICIMOD, really did a great job showing, and these are actually sources from ICIMOD itself. But we're also seeing soil erosion, glacier outbursts. So it's not just about emissions. It's not about developing an economy that's low emission. Actually, on a global level, it doesn't really make a difference. Nepal is emitting 0.1%, it could emit 0.2%, and it would not make a big difference at the global level. But as a country, you have to demonstrate good commitment. So I think it's more about commitment rather than your footprint. But the impacts of climate change, the effects of those emissions are really more critical for the country. So this whole notion starts to come in, right, that climate change is a two-way street. Think of it as a two-way street, not a single street. We need to get to 1.5 degree. We have to mitigate. We have to reduce emissions. We have to ensure, I think a comment was coming from you, that, we have to think about circular models, or someone else was about circular models, that we have to adopt circular models. We have to reduce our mitigation. We have to reduce our emissions. But we also have to think about adaptation. How do we reduce the impacts of climate change that are already happening? Like, even if we stop all emissions, there is a lag. The world will continue to heat up. So we have to think about both these elements. So I look at climate finance, right? Part of my work is now looking at how do we fund this transition, right? What would need to happen to tackle this challenge? And when we look at costs, they're very alarming, right? These numbers make, scare you. Because it's like, we need $38 trillion every year within the next 25 years. Like $38 trillion. Where will this money come from? But we also have to think about this really important element. There's like some fantastic research that's just come out in Nature. It's a very, very recent paper which estimated the which estimated the figure of 38 trillion. But what they specified, what we already know, but I think now we have data to back this up, is that when you look at the cumulative national emissions, right? We look at which country is emitting the most. And of course, the US, China, most of the developing countries are emitting the most. Actually, when you look at the change of their income, they're actually benefiting a lot. They're growing. The countries that emit the least, their income is actually dropping. So when we talk about Nepal, for example, we say, we emit only 0.1%. Actually, our incomes are dropping because of that lack of emission, because we're not using so much natural resource. We're not just burning coal and oil and timber and trees. So that actually is counterintuitive. It's actually a negative impact. Same with national GDPs. Countries with higher GDPs actually are doing relatively well. Countries with lower GDP are going to be suffer in terms of emissions. So then this region becomes really challenging for us, right? Because we are generally per capita low emitting region. But then just coming back to this finance perspective, What we've also seen while we need 38 trillion, what we've also seen over the last 10 years is that climate finance is actually rising. When you talk to funders, you'll say, you need to fund climate change, we need more finance, and they'll say, okay, look at the numbers. We've actually, from 2011, we're now actually at $1.26 trillion. So every year, $1.26 trillion are being spent. And that may seem a very large number. But when we look at the gap itself, we'll see that in order for us to get to 1.5 degree, we need not 1.2 trillion, we need about 6 trillion every year, and developing economies alone need $2.4 trillion each year. So of course, there's a huge gap between the amount of money that's available and the amount of money that's actually needed just by developing countries. And when you put the entire economy, then that figure goes up, and eventually that figure will reach $38 trillion. So the scale of the challenge is quite large, and the scale of the financing gap is huge. And I looked at some facts on Nepal as well. So what's really happening in Nepal? Well, Nepal says we need $46 billion by 2030 for mitigation and for adaptation. But if you look at this 10 years, Nepal has received about $4.4 billion. So we can see the gap even in just one single country. That's a low-emitting country that only emits 0.1%, but we also need 46 billion. So where will this money come from? And when you look at government spending, it's about 4 to 5%, really focused on climate action, on highly relevant climate action, which needs to be scaled. This is what research says, that needs to be scaled by 10 to 15%. Only when that investment will come in, it will start to unlock and get private sector to come in. But also our research shows that because the scale of the challenge is so big, because we need not billions, trillions, sadly, this will not come from public finance. Governments alone can't fund it. We need private sector to come in. And private sector, we had a panel on private sector as well. And private sector, when you talk to private sector, their demand is we need government support, not financial. We need an enabling environment. We need a commitment from government. So I think these two actors go hand in hand. We need private sector and government to work together, because only when government invests in climate change does it give confidence to the private sector to come in. And we're seeing a lot of that happen in other developed economies. For example, US, they have this Inflation Reduction Act that gave tax credits to private sector, and suddenly the investment in clean energy has gone up. But it was the lever that the government pulled. So we have to think about these two elements together. But is climate finance enough? Is 1.3 trillion enough? And you'll see here from a research perspective that actually just in 2022, government spent 2.2 trillion on military. Our fossil fuel subsidies, like most countries actually offer fossil fuel subsidies. They incentivize their consumers to actually use oil by giving them a cheaper price than what they buy. So they're spending $7 trillion, the global economy, on just giving subsidies. COVID response, when we had COVID, the world came together and they just spent money. They didn't care at that point. We spent, 11 trillion. So we can also see that just removing the fossil fuel subsidy, you can actually start funding. You don't need anything. You could start funding climate change action. It's that simple, but do the countries have willingness, the political will? Like COVID, if everyone came together and said, no, we have to deal with climate change on the same footing as COVID, we can generate money. So the point here is there is enough money around there. It's not a lack of money. Even though the figure is in trillions, That money is available. Now, the question is, can that money be deployed? Do we have the willingness and the political will and this collective approach for dealing with this problem? The other thing that we're seeing in climate change, which is also really important, is we already know this, right? Majority of the funding goes towards mitigation. In fact, I think it's about 94% of all climate finance, the 1.2 trillion, goes to mitigation, low emission technologies. Mostly in energy, mostly in transportation, but very little money, just 5-6% actually goes into adaptation. And when you start to approach private sector and say, you know what, you need to solve climate change, there's absolutely very, very little private sector engagement in resilience adaptation. And for us, that's the biggest challenge. Because adaptation resilience is a more urgent challenge for South Asia than mitigation. Yes, we need clean energy. Yes, we need low emission. Yes, we could have electric vehicles. You know, we need all of that. But what about the big floods that might come in? You know, we saw in the last presentation, right, that the mountain region is heating up twice as much as the other region. You know, the mountain region is what we call the third pole. You know, I think there are about 6,000 or 7,000 glaciers in that region. So imagine if those melt. So we need more money, but where will that money come from? Because private sector isn't coming in, and that's where we have to start thinking more in terms of how we develop sustainable models. Because if you go in, ask a private sector to fund flooding or flood a small community, their answer is, actually, it's not related to me. Why are you asking me this? There's no connection. So we have to build those connections. We have to build those sustainable models. Just a few more things on the climate finance side, because also it's very interesting that underlying climate finance is justice, is climate equity. Because the debate that's happening in climate finance is, yes, you know, we need someone to fund this. We need this 1.2 trillion, or Nepal would say, I need this $44 billion. I need this money. Where will this money come from? I'm only getting 4 billion. And the question is, this is where climate negotiations have to come in. This is where this historical obligation of developed countries who already developed have to pay. So here's an analysis. And what we see is, if we look at, based on a historic analysis, the US has to pay 50% of all climate finance because they've developed the most. And then you have all the other countries like Germany, Japan, United Kingdom, Canada. They've all developed at the back of using that environment. They were part of that GDP growth. They kept using raw materials. They burned their coal, they burned their oil, they did everything to grow. So they need to now pay. So this is the historical obligation. But it's more complicated now. Because once you go in these negotiations and you ask the US, okay, we need $1 trillion, or in this case, it's only $100 billion. That's what's been negotiated in climate negotiations. You go to the US and say, you know, you need to pay 50% of your share. I need $50 billion from you. And their answer is, why should we pay 50%? Because now China is the second largest economy. Look at their total emissions. They're higher. What about India? They're emitting a lot. So this whole debate is happening, you know, who is a developed country? Who is a developing country? Should we look at historical obligations? And if we look at the data and say, okay, forget past, let's look at future growth. Suddenly, US only has to pay 27%. Now you need to include China, you need to include India. All the countries in the gray are countries that have not historically polluted, but now are growing. So should those growing countries also be paying? How can they, you know, what about Saudi Arabia? This is a big question. It has the largest oil reserve, and Saudi says, no, historically I should be allowed to emit. But the world says, no, if Saudi keeps emitting, what will happen? So this is what's stalling all this finance. It's not about the money, it's about who should pay. And this is what's going to happen in the next negotiation, where you'll have more countries coming in. Rather than the 28 countries that are historically obligated, you'll probably have 50 countries that have to now pay. But even then, they're not also paying their fair share. So even that US has to pay 50%, it's actually paid $2 billion. Because it's a political issue for them. It's not a financial issue, remember. It's a political issue. The moment US pays climate money, their population comes and says, what about floods in our country? What about homelessness in our country? So that's the bigger challenge that all these countries are facing. So you'll have smaller countries like Norway, Sweden, and Germany. They're paying more than their fair share. The rest of the countries are all below their fair share. The other challenge we're facing in climate finance, and this is not for now, is there's no single definition. And I'm not going to go over this, but some might say, oh, climate finance is to deal with the impacts of climate change. Others say, no, it's actually a policy. No, climate finance is private sector mobilization. It depends on the country you come from. So there isn't one agreed definition. It's very broad, and people have their own perspective. Under the justice literature, we say climate finance should be additional, which means it should be over and above your development. Others say, no, development and climate is the same thing. If you develop, you become more resilient. So if my development money can also be charged as climate finance. So there's a lot of debate in what even climate finance is. And then there are many different instruments for climate finance as well. So when we're talking about climate finance, what are we speaking about? Are we talking about grants that many emerging developing countries are used to? That, okay, give us unconditional money. We need grants. And Nepal has been getting lots of grants as well from multilateral, but that figure is very low. It's shrinking because the scale of the challenge is going up. And I'm sure many of you know that historically, development finance was set at 0.7% of the GDP. But I think a few years ago, UK cut it down to 0.5 because they don't want to give development money. So this grant is a challenge. There's so much issue on loans. So the next option is, yes, you go to ADB. World Bank is also supporting here. They'll give technical assistance, but a lot of that money comes in the form of concessional loans. And there's a challenge of equity there. Should loans be allowed in climate finance? Because you have to pay them back. If you're talking about a historical obligation, then loans should be there. What about equity, guarantees, impact-based finances, blended finance? All these different instruments are coming in to solve these challenges. So my ask for you, especially everyone who's sitting there, when we talk about climate finance, ask them, what's the instrument? What are we talking about here? What's the source of the money? Is this additional? Is it not? It will help articulate what we're talking about. How much time do we have? We're okay? Yeah, okay, perfect. Because I want to go in kind of this last portion, because I know we all can speak very well on problems and challenges. But it's also, I think, we could start to move more towards a solution approach as well. And so we've all been moving to sustainable. Like this whole notion, this whole terminology of sustainable development has really started to come up, right? That, okay, we need to develop. First, it was like, no. There's a conflict between development and sustainability. But then it said, no, what about sustainable development? Can we do both? And when you look at the definition, right, it's a very simple definition that sustainable development is, or sustainability is, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think in the opening session, one of the speakers, used that Native American adage, which is relevant, that, we don't inherit this earth, we borrow it from our children. So the question here is, for sustainable development, we have to meet the needs of the present generation. But we have to make sure that we leave the earth intact for the future generation. But if countries are asked to sacrifice and say, no, you have to slow down your development, you can't emit, it will affect your present generation. So it's really important to think about this notion that it's not a compromise. We can't give up what we need today for the future. But we have to ensure we are stewards our role in this earth, or in this place, is to be guardians for the next generation. So there's this debate, there's this conversation that's going in, saying that we are, in a way, the first generation that actually knows about climate change, has experienced climate change, understands more and more about climate change. So we can't use this notion that we didn't do anything, because we know it. So it even gives us more responsibility to react and think about sustainability. In a very simple way, we can say we want to do good without doing any harm. So this whole notion of doing good and do no harm. I think this is the philosophy that companies, countries have started to adopt. Yes, don't do any harm, do good. But there's even a more better way, even a more stronger, like this is where we challenge countries to say, okay, you want to sustainably develop, but you can even do more. Don't just stop here. So if you look at this spectrum, right, this is business as usual growth. This is the graph that we saw that was just going in the sky and forever was rising. Linear growth. What is sustainable growth? Sustainable growth is seeking growth while minimizing impacts. Yes, we want to grow, but we want no harm. But that's also not enough, right? Because we are sitting in a place in Nepal which has immense biodiversity. It's so sensitive to nature that we have to start thinking about how can we achieve growth while achieving issue-specific positive impacts? How can we still grow but increase our forest cover, increase our biodiversity, increase our resources, take them up. So all the metrics are going up, we're still growing. That's about restorative. And we're hearing that this is coming in the policy, right? That we want to focus on issue-specific. But at the highest level, at the most inspirational level, what we call regenerative model, is you want to seek growth, but you want to change the system in which you operate. We work in a very linear growth-focused system, which relies on raw material. So how can we start to think about a system-wide positive impact? And we started to hear a little bit in the policy, systems change. How do we connect? How do we change the system? Why do we want to change the system? We want to change the system because the existing system will not allow us to get here. Because the existing system actually holds the status quo, is based on growth, is reliant on raw materials. The energy system here is reliant on burning agriculture waste. So going in, asking people not to burn may not change. Asking people to burn it in a better way might make it more sustainable, but it's not going to make an impact. How do we start to change the system? Why do they burn? What's happening? Is this a livelihood issue? Is it an access issue? So I think regeneration is where we really want to move towards. And this is a colleague based in Oxford who's written this book, Donut Economics. And she's been like promoting a lot of this philosophy as an economist. She's like, I'm an economist who argues with other economists of saying, actually, our model is not linear. Our model is circular. This is a circular economy model. These are the planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström put in, that you can't exceed these boundaries because there's nothing after this boundary. If you exceed the boundary, the Earth goes. Here are sustainable elements. Our population needs not just education, it needs food, water, energy, networks, housing. We need to provide these social services to them. But we need to grow, so we need to provide this, but we can't exceed this. So there is a space. We need to find this space, which we call the safe space, safe and just space for humanity. This is what a regenerative and distributed economy looks like. And it's hard to say what it looks like. But this is the aim, that we have to look through it. So what she's been doing, which is very interesting, she's been doing this donut economics for many, many cities, countries. Like you could make a donut economic for Kathmandu and say, okay, what are we short on? What's the shortfall? Where are we exceeding? Where are we doing well? Where are we not doing well? So it gives you another frame to look at how we can build a regenerative economy. So I would highly encourage, she has some fantastic work on donut economics, donut lab. She has some TED Talks as well. Do listen to her talk, and she makes a lot of sense. So I quickly want to go in this last segment. We have 5 minutes. Okay, I'll go quick. I want to give you like just these 5 quick ways forward. A lot of this research, this is based on empirical research we've been carrying out. A lot of this research is based on large corporations, not just countries. And I'm comfortable sharing this here because, as I said, Apple is a $3 trillion company. It's bigger than 190 countries. So what Apple is doing, what other large companies are doing, I think we can also understand and learn not just the positive, but also what to counter. So 5 ways to think about it. Number 1, we have to have an aspirational economic purpose. Very clear, and I was, in the last session, I was reading, I wrote it down as well, that our purpose, in a way we say, is prosperous Nepal and happy Nepali. But what's important is one has to dissect this and say, what does it actually mean? What does a happy Nepali mean? Does a happy Nepali mean when he has all the resources? He has good housing, good education? So you have to have a very clear aspirational purpose, and large companies and businesses do that really well. You ask anyone in a large organization, what's your purpose? They can define it because they've operationalized it. They've put those metrics in. The second is leverage your core capabilities. Third is build partnerships and collaboration. Fourth is measure and track. And fifth is take a long-term view. And I'll very quickly go over this. Like I looked at many countries, right? And, sorry. Like there are 2 ways of defining your purpose, because I think it's very important that we, and Nepal as a nation, has a collective approach. We've been hearing in these sessions as well that, sometimes it's fragmented. People have different ways of thinking. Especially there are many young people sitting here. So it's very important to have like a very clear economic purpose. And, we have leadership, so leadership has to lead this. It's very important. You can make any aspiration. We call this your reason of living, reason of being. So you can make any aspiration and say, this is what I want. This is what I want Nepal to look like. Or you can go back and say, I want to go in the history of Nepal, and I want to see what we're good at. What does Nepal stand for? What is our soft power? What is our advantage over the rest of the world? And so you can look in your DNA, or you can make your own plan. And many countries have started to, it's not perfect. And I use some example of South Asia, but they started to think about, okay, what we want to develop a diversified, innovative nation, or we want an ecologically sound and peace. So everyone has their own element into it. Some says we want city and nature. Some says, we want industrial sector to rule. So we have to think about what is Nepal's advantage. So question for everyone here is, what key aspiration goals Nepal wants to achieve beyond just economic growth? What do you want to solve for? What would a happy Nepali look like? I just picked it up from your development that there's rural resilience, there's hydropower potential. We heard a lot about those specific elements, but I think it's important to bring them together and say, how do these elements add to what Nepal's vision is? The second important thing is very, very critical, and I think often countries miss this, is you have to leverage your core capabilities. What are the core capabilities of this country? What is the core capability of Nepal? What are you good at? UAE, of course, is an energy market country. So they started to say, how do we use our energy, our oil, to transition to green energy? Because oil is going to finish. We have to move. So they're thinking about financial instruments. So they're trying to build a UAE of tomorrow, but using their oil expertise. I looked at Estonia. They're the country that's going very digital. So they decided our core capability is electric vehicles. We want to set up electric vehicles for the world. So I think the question here for Nepal is, what core national capability Nepal has and wants to build to achieve its aspirational goal? So it has to connect back to your vision. If you are saying hydro is an area you all want to develop, what will development of hydro help you achieve with your goals? Is it prosperity? Is it happiness? How will that money flow to the community as well? So I think all those things need to come in. I looked at Nepal's export, right? And you can see, when you want to build your core capabilities, you have to start identifying the sectors you already export. This is what Nepal is already doing. How can you make it better? How can you expand this? How can you scale this? And I think that's the question you have to think about. Like, what things within this existing sector, these are your core capabilities, can be scaled? We have to build collaboration, right? This is something that cannot be done on its own. It's not something that countries can do, because there's a lot of expertise out there. You know, we have the World Bank helping here. We spoke about the Green Climate Fund. There's the Asian Development Bank. There are many entities. So if you want to scale, you have to think, who should be in this room? So the question here is, who else needs to be involved within and beyond Nepal to achieve the goal? What is the role of the private sector? How do we make them central to what we're doing? Because these are key actors. We have to measure and track, very important. I think one thing in my research when I came here, I realized that Nepal was tracking many things. We had the LAPA, the NAPA. I know there was work happening on budget coding as well. I don't know what the progress is. But it's very important to measure and track progress, because then you can see what's happening. So the question here is, you know, what are the metrics that Nepal will measure to track success of its outcomes? What are the outcomes that you are looking? So you connect it back to the outcomes. And then finally, I think this was already in the plan as well that we saw, you have to take a long-term view. This is not a short-term approach. This is a long-term, inclusive, equitable approach. So the question you have to think about when you're building this, how will Nepal bring its entire population along its journey? It's not a policy thing. If you're thinking about a happy Nepali, I would assume that they have all information. They understand what the country is doing. They understand what the goals are. So I think it's all about communication. It's also ensuring that you don't leave certain segments behind. I think there were lots of questions happening on justice, on financial inclusion, on women, on rural communities. So how do you ensure that everyone is going together? It's not just a certain segment. And I think that is critical for sustainable development. I'm not going to go into systems approach, but I want to just close with quick three examples that I think would be very useful to see. One is this Ethiopian Agriculture Transformation Agency. I had a long interview with this agency, and it was fascinating for me. This one single agency within 10 years was able to add 0.75% to the GDP of Ethiopia. I think about 600 or 700 million, one agency. So I asked them, how did you do this? What happened? And they said, you know what, actually, we created an entity that was only meant to focus on transformation in the agriculture sector. Because you don't need new things. They're just gaps in the market. You need some agency that's connecting the dots, that's looking at all the different actors. Public sector focuses on their policies. Private sector focuses on what they're doing. Communities look at what they're focused on. Who is looking at the whole picture? And they realized there's a missing agency. So they put this agency together, and all it did was get all these different actors to collaborate. We talk about collaboration. Collaboration is not easy. We can get people in the room, but how do you truly collaborate? So this is a great example of an entity that really did well, and Khalid Bombo, who heads this, is now doing something similar for Kenya. For other countries are now coming to this agency. How did you do this? So I think we can learn a lot from these agencies. Remanufacturing China, policy. They put a policy in that, any manufacturer that recycles will get a rebate. And suddenly that policy incentive, because we can ask people to recycle. We can say, okay, do recycling, a circular economy. I'll do it. Someone else may not do it. You put a tax benefit and say, if your car has 20% recycled material, this is the tax break. Suddenly people will do it. And final example is these modular buildings. policy comes in that if you construct a building, right? Right now what happens? You construct a building, you destroy it after 10, 20 years. Modular building allows you 20% recovery of these buildings. So now new policies are coming in codes that says you have to use material that can be taken out. And so there's price incentives as well. So I wanted to end my talk where I started from. You know, this whole question about sustainability and growth. And going back to the mountain where we're saying, you know, yes, we're destroying the mountain. So what happened? Like, what happened for this? This is a business that was producing these very successful equipment. And they realized our equipment is destroying the mountain. They formed these new, and you probably can see this here in Nepal, they actually got these new forms of pitons, which are these chalk ones. They don't destroy the mountain. So the question here was, by focusing on an issue and not saying, okay, I can keep growing, they're like, how do we find a solution for this? We need a sustainable solution that does not destroy the mountain. So you have to put this problem right at the center. Sustainability is not something that's good to do or is nice to do. Sustainability is how you operate business. And if you put sustainability at the center, you start to create solutions that solve for sustainability, not just for profitability. So this is the innovation. And the company, I've seen so many people wear these clothing, Patagonia. This is the history of Patagonia. This is how this company became a billion-dollar company, because they said, no, environment first, mountain first. So I leave you with this one final quote that from a colleague at business school. He says, what is a sustainable model? What is the role of a business? What is the role of society? It's about producing profitable solutions for the problems of the people and the planet, and not profiting from creating those problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abrar, for illuminating presentation. Let's take a seat, please. So a couple of questions we'll take from the floor, if any. The volunteers should be somewhere around, then please give the mic here, out here in the first row. Professor Karna.
Dr. Abrar, I'm not making it very lengthy. Just I want more elaboration from your part. Though you highlighted some of the aspects, we know not only the case of Nepal, but the entire South Asian region, the countries are the countries of villages. Nepal lives in villages. In that perspective, how can we leverage traditional ecological to enhance modern sustainable practices and policies?
Just repeat the question.
Yeah, once again, how can we leverage traditional ecological to enhance modern sustainable practices and policies in Nepal's perspective?
Ecological practices, right? How do we build ecological practices for building?
Let's give a couple of more, right?
Okay.
And we can answer together. Professor Timilchin. Professor Karna. Professor Timilchin.
Thank you very much for such a very good educative lecture. In my opinion, I still remember it. I'm a Kathmanduite. 69 years back, we used to have a flood in Kathmandu. You know, Kathmandu was flooded. Even that time. And that time we were not discussing, we didn't know anything about climate change. So, it's not a question. You have mentioned about the financial, the grant, multilateral, bilateral. support from developed country. But we are not getting so much. We are not getting. They are not listening. To my mind, at the end, you try to mention that it should be a population or the people base. In 1950s, we had the same problem with the family planning. You know, population growth was very high. We adopted that. And in the same way, the women empowerment or the concern on the women, also we launched campaign, you know. Another campaign we did it for the literacy. I remember in 50s, early 50s, 3%, or around 4% of Nepalis were literate, now more. So similarly, if we can campaign within the country at the people's level, by our local government, what do you think that approach, if we adopt, and if the government takes that initiative, that will also empower within the country, and even it will also help to pressurize the international community or the developed countries. This is my queries, you know. If you do, we are not, if you ask to the common people at the village, they don't know anything about the climate change. They don't know. So I think that campaign, if we adopt, then I think it will have a great pressure to the international community also. Thank you very much for such a good lecture. Thank you, Professor Chaudhary, Dr. Chaudhary.
Thank you, sir. We'll keep a couple of more questions. Professor Tiwari.
Very, I think, a small question. So, looking at your presentation, one of the very striking information that I found is that the climate finance, most of the climate finance goes to the mitigation rather than adaptation, whereas in developing countries like Nepal or LDCs, you know, we have a adaptation, a constant requirement, and that is known to even the developed countries. In spite of that, why developed countries are not willing to give more fund for the adaptation? Thank you so much.
Two more questions we were taking. One from Professor Shake out there.
Hello, yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your nice presentation, Dr. Abrar Chaudhary. So we must give you very thankful with your presentations and reasonable as well. So by the way, I'm just wondering that we are having such issues that climate changing is being a so serious issue nowadays for everyone and seriously in Nepal as well. And also we came to know that we are missing the agriculture productions, and even in GDP also we are getting less by the 2%, whatever you have presented here. In this condition, what kind of a climate finance model we should, you know, apply in our country? This is just my questions to you. Thank you so much.
So what type of climate finance?
Climate finance model. I'm just asking. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's speak two more and answer together, right? Professor Sanjay, Professor Paudel, and Professor Mani. Final, okay?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Abrar, for your very nice illuminating presentation. I have a small concern regarding this nature of the problem is considered as the global problem, but we need to have local solutions for this, all the environmental problems, the literature says. And in light of the federal governance system in this country and in several other countries, that adaptation practices is more pragmatic from the local perspective, from the local governance, but from the mitigation policy that comes from the federal policies, right? So how this adaptation and mitigation measures could harmonize to have a solution for the long-term solution of this climate change in your view? Thank you.
You can't be loud, sir. You can't be louder with our mic.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. It's very really enjoyable talk you did, and very important topics as well, particularly to Nepalese context too. I have only two comments or kind of suggestion. Number one, when we face the problem, meltdown problem, or whatever the name you say, it is because of modernization, right? Until when we use the consumption pattern, we had the consumption pattern based on the local and indigenous product, we didn't have that kind of problem. Still, Nepal is maintaining more or less compared to so many other countries, but we are facing the problem globally as part of the globalizations and all these things, right? One way to solve this problem in the context of Nepal may be to develop the nature-based scientific policy for the development. And equally, the financing part also should be done like that. If you go for emission production per capita, we have less than 0.5 megaton per year, something like that. But you were talking about the Qatar or UAE, they have more than 40 plus megaton per capita per year. That means whoever produce more emission, they should be penalized to us. That's the clear message we are trying to deliver from last few years. And this should be a global agenda, and that will help to protect the jungles, even Himalayas, resources of the drinking water, so and so. And if that could be included somewhere in your presentation, that will add the value in the context as well. That's my suggestion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Final one, please. Professor Ian Money. Try to be brief, please.
Yeah. The organizers has placed this session as a plenary. This plenary session as a final session is very good. It is extraordinary. It is more meaningful. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, they are putting this session as final session, and everyone is leaving here with a heavy heart. What we are going to do to have solutions. So when is touched upon two things. One is the Fredman's irresponsibility. That is, no need any corporate social responsibility. And such kind of measures or focus that leads to this kind of a issue. And one more that often we are speaking that consumerism. And the consumerism also leads to this kind of issues. Instead of speaking about consumerism, we have to strongly discuss about the productionism. The products are produced not for consumption, it is for production. The producers are finding ways and means to selling the products. And these kind of sales, that leads to one kind of climate change. And when we think about these issues very closely, I'm sorry, very, very sorry to say that there are some roots in our history, in our biblical, don't misunderstand, I don't want to disturb anybody's faith, but in a Bible, in the first chapter, Genesis itself, God created the world first. He has created the sky and everything. And sixth day, He has created the human being. And He says that, you please enjoy everything that has been produced here. This is written in 2000 years ago. So, all these things which leads to climate change. This kind of a mentality. So, what I finally put as a question is that the regenerative model has to be incorporate these kind of issues. We have to go beyond these regenerative issues. And finally, I am putting direct question, one simple question, without touching upon the corporate capitalism, without touching upon the profiteering corporate capitalism, Is it possible to control or reduce the climate change?
Okay, all right. Okay, these are very wonderful questions, and I can pick out themes. I'm not going to answer specific. I think one theme that's really coming out is this notion of mitigation versus adaptation. Like, how do we fund this? How do we fund adaptation? And within that are some of those ecological practices. So you're absolutely right. I think something that we've all been advocating in climate finance, climate change, is that there's a huge skew. Mitigation is something is getting the lion's share of all climate finance. So when I show you 1.2 trillion, many developed countries celebrate that. Look, we're spending so much money, but when you go deeper into it, you realize this is all on energy, transportation. Then you go deeper into it, a lot of this is by businesses, private sector buying products. So then you start to question, okay, where is the money coming for adaptation that the world needs? I think, in a way, it's not a very positive example. I think it's a negative example, but what is starting to happen is, I think 2 days ago, 3 days ago, there was a big flood in Europe. And I think many people, I think it was 20, 30 people died. I think there was floods in Germany, there was flood in Canada. When events like these happen in developed countries, it shocks them. Because they're like, our infrastructure is perfect, it can't happen. So suddenly this language of adaptation has started to make in countries that never spoke about adaptation. They only spoke about climate change, energy, mitigation, carbon price. For them, climate change was carbon, only carbon. And I think that shift is happening because now adaptation is becoming more important. I think Green Climate Fund is making an effort, World Bank, many multilaterals now specifically focus on adaptation. The problem or the challenge with adaptation is that we are still looking at adaptation through our conventional growth model. So everyone says, what's the business case out of adaptation? There is no business case out of adaptation because we're not trying to look at profitability. So then we have to think of different metrics because not every challenge of adaptation, if I'm saying there's a problem with my water supply or the water is depleting, you can't always make a business case out of it. And I think we've so far been trying to prove that. We've all been trying to find a business case. So that's why the money for adaptation is going low. So I think two things are what we're hoping are going to happen. One is that the world is now waking up to adaptation, so they're open to finding other models for funding adaptation. Impact-based adaptation, blended finance. What we're also seeing is, like, I think that question, I'll club that question in, that how do you fund, what can governments do? What we're also seeing is that private sector traditionally was not coming into adaptation. My argument to private sector is, it's your problem. Your supply chain is being disrupted. When a farmer, crops go under flood, actually who's buying the product? Yes, we buy product to eat, but you're also buying it for your products. So if it's not your problem, whose problem is this? So now you have to secure your supply chain. So it's also about language. So with businesses, I never speak adaptation, I say supply chain risk. Because they understand supply chain risk. They understand risk. So you say climate is just another business risk for you. And so businesses start to say, okay, yes, it's a problem. I need to invest in securing my supply chain. So it's also about language, also about communication. It's also about thinking about those things. So I think businesses are rising. I think one good thing that's happening globally is that new regulations are coming in, these sustainability standards that are asking businesses to report on their risks. And I think by doing that, they have started to talk about it at least. Climate has gone up in their agenda. I took a slide out, but if you ask business what's the biggest threat, right now they'll say AI, but in 10 years, the top 5 risks are all climate related, resource related. So they understand this depletion. To this question on what can governments do, I think governments have a very, very important role, or the model of financing that we say is about de-risking. Private sector comes in And the reason why they don't invest in resilience or adaptation, or global funds don't come in or invest in Nepal or Kenya or these many emerging countries, because they say it's a high-risk country. I don't agree with that. They say it's high risk. I said, why is this high risk? Oh, political instability. Okay, so what does that mean? No, it's financial instability. Okay, what does that mean? Explain to me. So then, because they don't want to invest, or they're making reasons. So governments can play this role by investing in this sector and showing it's not high risk. Local private sector can invest in supply chain and climate adaptation and say, look, if I'm making money, why can't other people make money out of this? So it's about de-risking. This is what local entities, local governments can play, is demonstrate, de-risk, show the business case. Investors will come in. Investors come in, climate finance comes in because they're looking for opportunities. So if you demonstrate opportunities, they'll come. My final point, and I think this is just, I think it's very important, this is going back to core capabilities. I think Nepal has so much, it's close to my heart because as I said, this is where my PhD started. This is where I spent so much time talking to communities here. You have to think about what does Nepal have? Nepal has so much natural resources, right? It has so much biodiversity. It has so much natural capital that the world wants and wants to view. You know, when we go to, I take my students to farms in England, and there's only monocropping. There's not even any insect left there. You know, we used to drive cars in South Asia. I don't know if it happens here. There would be so many insects hitting your windscreen all the time. You go on a bike, there's insect. You go to England, there's no insect. They've killed all the biodiversity. So this is the places that preserve those biodiversity, and we should be charging them for this biodiversity. We should be showing them. So I think we have to take this proactive approach. If we wait for funding, if we wait for multilaterals, they're not coming. They'll give you some money, but think every country has this issue. We have to create solutions, we have to create products, we have to say, what does Nepal have to offer? And we have to go to them and say, this is what you have to pay us for, rather than we need money to do something. I think this is the approach that needs to happen, and money will come.
Thank you, Abrar. A lively discussion, lively debate in this pertinent topic. Let me wrap up in 1 minute. Let me try to summarize what we talked, right, very briefly. I have come some of the notes, but I will try to be laconic again. The starting theme was we obeyed the short economies with height, we call it Milton Friedman, and we were trapped somewhere. And adaptation is not sufficient. Some of the example comes from our professors, Kathmandu flood to Europe flood. That's how mitigation is important now, and he reiterated that mitigation is important. Adaptation phase is almost done now. Adaptation only is not going to solve the climate crisis. That's the second theme he talked about. And third one was 38 trillion a year for 25 years is a meticulous calculation and is a scary number. And out of that, Nepal needs 46 billion annually, and we invest only 4.4 billion and a deficit of 41.6 billion. Another scary number, but nicely presented and well aware to us. A lot of policymakers and all influential researchers and media people out here, that helped a lot. Then per the presentation, he highlighted the reluctance of private sector to indulge into the solution, or right solution of this climate crisis, and the commitment from the government side, and he nicely elaborated about it. And private sector commitment is kind of challenging, not only in developing countries, in all over the world. That's what I understood from his presentation. And later part, then we should pay. There are country level, not only industry level and individual household level, country level free ridings are there. Couple of countries' name is spelled out, right from oil producer to consumer as well. The free riding is happening, and that's where we have to correct and and some of the climate instruments are there, and he talked right from grants to blended finance, and each and every one makes sense for developing countries and for Nepal and most of the South Asian countries, I think. Then after he talked about redefined sustainable development, and the first, second, third, and fourth point, were really illuminating, and that makes that completely resonates and resembles our theme, many of the presentations, ultimate past presentations, and a lot of papers. Then and finally, and what we learned from his presentations, 5 takeaways for Nepal, and out of them, some good examples as well. And the final words, thank you everyone, thank you Abrar, and lively debates from renowned professors out there that really benefited us. Then final note would be, miles to go before we'll sleep. It already looks like late, but we are committed, borrowing YV, it's miles to go before we'll sleep, and miles to go before we'll sleep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for such a compelling and thought-provoking presentation. Your thorough exploration of climate finance, corporate responsibility, the role of different countries in contributing to and mitigating climate change has given us much to consider. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Thapa, for guiding today's session with such expertise and insight. Your extensive knowledge in environmental economics and climate policy has greatly enriched our discussions, and we are truly grateful for your contributions. To express our heartfelt appreciation for your invaluable contributions today, I would now like to invite the Head of Department of CEDECON, Professor Dr. Ram Prasad Gyawali, to present token of appreciation to Dr. Abrar Chaudhary.
Okay. This token of appreciation is presented to Dr. Abrar Chaudhary in recognition of delivering a plenary lecture at the CEDECON's annual international conference in economics, September 21-22, 2024, Kathmandu, Nepal, hosted by Central Department of the Economics, Tribhuvan University, on the day of September 22, 2004, Central Department of the Economics, CEDECON, Tribhuvan University, Kirtipur, Kathmandu.
I'll come here as well.